Hello there, welcome to this game review. So in this game, you played quite well against quite a strong opponent. There are a few points to improve, especially regarding some piece exchanges and calculation. Especially calculation when we're in a winning position and we feel that something should be there. So we have to be able to find that something. And for that, calculation is the best tool to end the game. So e4, d6. So with the opening, I wouldn't really suggest playing this in the long term, as it doesn't really fight for the center. It allows white to take the perfect center, and a lot of people like these systems, but objectively they're not great, and also they're kind of passive, as the opponent has a lot of different systems to give you problems, and there's no clear solution. Of course, bishop d3 and taking on e5 is not very challenging, as now the d file is open and black has as much space as white, and this bishop is badly placed. At this point, white can't really hope for an advantage. So instead, white can, for example, play c3 or knight c3 and knight f3, normally developing the pieces, and the white is just slightly better because of the space. So I would suggest playing some more normal openings, as you will realize in the long term you will have to switch to some real openings anyway. So the sooner you do it, the better, and it will help your results and confidence in the opening as well. Okay, here black has no problems, and it seems you knew how to develop the pieces. Now that the d-pawn is moved, this bishop is not as bad anymore. The knight goes to d7. It is maybe not the most precise, as now this bishop will be blocked, and this bishop usually goes to e6, but okay, knight bd7, h6, and this is also a bit of a mistake in opening principles. In the opening we have three goals: to fight for the center, develop the pieces, and to castle the king. So generally our moves in the opening should aim for one of these three goals, preferably all of them as soon as possible. And h6 doesn't help with any of them. It stops bishop g5 or knight g5, but both of these moves are not threatening. Bishop g5 doesn't do anything. This pin will never be used. Knight g5 with the bishop on d3 also is not threatening. We can just develop the bishop either to c5 or to d6, and black is fine. But okay, now c6. And at this point, since black has moved 2 pawns without any reason, at this point white is actually able to gain some kind of initiative and try to get some kind of advantages. Knight c4 now attacks the bishop, and with the move b3 played, white is also in time to develop the bishop quickly on this diagonal, where it is best placed anyway. Now if the bishop moves here, bishop a3 would be quite uncomfortable, because we cannot castle, and this is an important square. Otherwise, if we just defend, well, we are losing the bishop pair, which is almost always not very good, and white has a very great position. One idea is to develop the bishop to a3, but he can also just remaneuver the knight, and the black is clearly worse because he has not developed his pieces. A lot of pawn moves have been made. Black has no dark squared bishop, so the dark squares, especially on d6, will be very weak. So some opening principles should be remembered. Okay, bishop b2, queen e7, knight c4, bishop c7, and this is kind of fine. Now if bishop a3, we can play knight c5, and we should play knight c5. Of course, this move pins the knight, but there's no real way to use the pin. We can continue with a5 or castles, or of course castles first. The knight is rather stable here. If we played c5, then this would allow this square to become terribly weak, which would allow white to use it very swiftly. So, okay, a4 castles, knight e3, so white is trying to use this square, but it's quite easy to defend. g6 is one way to do it, but knight c5 is probably more accurate. The knight wants to go to c5 anyway to open up this bishop, as if we don't open the bishop and if we don't develop it, well, we are going to be down a rook and a bishop. So the sooner we solve this problem, the better. Okay, g6, queen e2, rook d8. So again, it seems black is not really solving his main issue, which is the rook and the bishop. But okay, and white is playing quite passively as well. King h7 and g4. So white is trying to do something at this point, but doing it like this is a bit too ambitious, as all of white's pieces are in the center and the queen side, and the king is castled here, so this just creates weaknesses. And it doesn't really create any threat, as g5 can be met in a variety of ways, mainly knight h5 to f4. So here black noticed this weak square on f4 and decided to put his knight there, which makes sense. Generally, I would suggest not making such long maneuvers when our pieces are not developed, because in the meantime something can happen, and white should be using his lead in development. So here, again, we should try to develop these pieces, at least give them the opportunity to be developed. But we can also think about the square. So knight c5 comes to mind, going to e6, and then to f4 or d4, while also opening up the bishop, giving us some ideas of maybe h5 to try to create weaknesses on the king side, or simply bishop d7 to at least get the rook into the game at some point. Okay, knight e8. This is a bit of a longer maneuver. It gets our pieces quite congested. Okay, king g2, and white seems to not really understand what's going on. Instead, white should have tried to stop this maneuver, for example, rook a d1, and after knight g7 he can play knight bishop c4, trying to stop knight e6, simply taking it. And here white would still be doing quite well. He can double on the d-file, and soon, if we don't do something with our pieces, it will become very, very unpleasant, which it already is at this point. So this is why we shouldn't make such long maneuvers when our pieces are not developed. Remember the opening principles: piece development, control of the center, and castle. We have castle, we have good control over the center, and now instead of these maneuvers, we should try to finish development. Okay, knight e8, and the knight successfully arrives at f4. White has not really done anything in the meantime, so now black is just winning because of one terribly weak square. And again, black still has to develop pieces, which he is successful in, knight c5. And at this point, we should understand black is just winning because of the king safety and the weak square in f4. But black will still have to find a way to open up the position. One of these is to play f5 or maybe h5, and there's not much else. Another way to break through would be to play on d3, on the d3 square, which is what black tries. Okay, bishop a3, and now bishop d6 is played, but this is kind of a passive move. White didn't really have any threats here, so there's no reason to react. But the move f5 is very instructive. Of course, it will require some calculation, especially with this bishop here, but this bishop can be taken at any point by the pieces. f5 has the clear threat of taking on e4, which makes white's hand quite forced. If he takes here, we will recapture. And who does the open g file benefit? It seems it's black, since he's threatening mate in a few moves. Well, if this knight wasn't here, but the main threat is again this, and white is having a lot of trouble dealing with all these threats because his king is also on g3. So there's not that much else to calculate, and black is just winning because he has put his pieces in decent positions and opened up the position because of the opponent's weak king. So okay, knight bishop d6. So now black's advantage is more of a positional nature. He can still think about opening up the position with f5, but now that e5 is hanging, it's a bit more difficult. And now knight takes d3 is played, but this is quite a big strategic and positional mistake. This knight is clearly a lot better than this bishop, and unless you have some kind of very concrete follow-up after knight takes d3, we shouldn't really exchange good pieces for bad pieces. Instead, we could just keep the tension with f6, next develop the bishop to e6, we could just develop the rook to the d-file, double on the d-file as well, or h5 to open up some files on the king side, and black just has a huge positional advantage. He has all the dark squares, he has the unopposed dark squared bishop. White can't really do anything about this. Kind of a more tactical solution is this, with the idea that if c3 then this is hanging, and if queen d1 then bishop c3, which also improves the position. But knight takes d3 now gives up black's main positional advantage. Sure, black is still better because of the bishop pair and the numerous weaknesses, but now this king is not as unsafe. Okay, f6, a5, h4, queen e6. So black finally has opened up the position, which is what we should do with the bishop pair, f3 and b5, opening up the queen side as well. At some point we will have to develop the rook, so I guess this is one way to do it. b5, queen e5, bishop d7, and now black is again completely winning because of the bishop pair, the terribly weak king, and again these weaknesses. But a few moves later the position was slightly misplayed, queen e3, so the game is almost over. And at this point we have a lot of different moves to play. White is threatening something like a perpetual check here. Queen f7, king h8, queen f6, king g8, queen g6, etc. And it is quite unpleasant and something we should not really allow. But it's clear that the position is forced enough that we should be able to find something. In the game, queen f2 was played, but this is not very convincing, specifically because the queen ends up on a bad square after knight takes g4. Instead, queen f4 could be calculated, and here white has only two candidate moves, one of which can be instantly tossed away because of bishop g4. So the only thing to think about is king g2, and here we can again take it. And the important point is the queen now defends the f7 square, so white does not have counterplay. So he has to play something like queen e4, and let's say we exchange. At the end of this, we still have the bishop pair, we have 2 pawns up, and it's likely that black will win material on this diagonal as well. So the game is effectively over. But instead, queen f2, now the king has to go to h3, and here black has to take, and the bishop g4 is played. But this is more of a piece exchange rather than a win. Instead, queen f4 could be played, but of course it is rather murky at this point. Black does have a pawn advantage, but he has weakened his own king. White has some ideas of his own, so maybe bishop g4 was the more practical solution, going towards an endgame, which is of course good for black since he has 2 pawns. But white has some small initiative. After knight e4, there are numerous threats we have to take. Now white's rook is threatening to invade, so bishop d4 has to be played. And at this point, white had the move rook c1, which is of course very logical, with the threat of going here. And with this pawn and this knight, white has a lot of threats against our king. So even though we have 2 pawns up, our king is quite unsafe. And at this point, it seems rook f8 is the only move, but it's not terribly obvious. The point is to stop knight f6, and next black will be able to start taking the pawns. And black should be winning, but it's not very clear-cut. After rook f1, however, king g7 improves the position while stopping the threat, and now white has lost precious time. Rook b6 is a good move, and from here, black finds a way to win the game, quite convincingly, by pushing the a pawn and trapping the rook as well. So generally quite an interesting game, but there were a few positional mistakes after the opening that were made, which should be thought about, and mainly the opening is not very precise, as we did not really develop pieces, we pushed a lot of pawns unnecessarily. All of these are breaking the opening principles, which tell us to develop the pieces, castle the king, and control the center. So there's something to think about there as well. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.